The year was 1992, and James Hetfield was sitting alone in a dark hotel room in Los Angeles, staring at a bottle of vodka that had become his only companion through countless sleepless nights. The Black Album had just transformed Metallica into the biggest metal band on the planet, selling millions of copies and filling stadiums across the world. Yet the man behind those thundering riffs had never felt more empty, more lost, or more convinced that everything he had built was about to collapse around him. What the world saw was a conquering hero of heavy metal, a frontman whose voice could command 80,000 people to raise their fists in unison. But what nobody knew was that behind closed doors, James Hetfield was falling apart at the seams, drowning in alcohol, consumed by demons he could not name, and sliding toward a darkness from which there might be no return. That night, at 3:17 in the morning, his phone rang, and the gravelly voice on the other end belonged to a man who had seen more rock and roll destruction than anyone alive. A man who understood the specific loneliness of fame. A man who would say something in the next 45 minutes that would pull James Hetfield back from the edge and change the course of metal history forever. Lemmy Kilmister had no idea he was about to save a life, and James Hetfield would keep this secret buried for more than 2 decades, never speaking of it publicly until the day Lemmy died, and the weight of that silence became too heavy to carry alone. If this story resonates with you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, and because what you are about to hear is one of the most closely guarded secrets in heavy metal history. A story of brotherhood, survival, and the unlikely bond between two men who understood that rock and roll could save your soul just as easily as it could destroy it. To understand what happened that night in 1992, you first need to understand what James Hetfield was carrying on his shoulders and why the greatest commercial triumph of his career had become the heaviest burden he had ever known. The Black Album, released in August of 1991, was not just a record, but a seismic event that fundamentally altered the landscape of heavy metal and transformed Metallica from underground thrash heroes into genuine mainstream superstars. The album debuted at #1 in 10 countries. It sold over 500,000 copies in its first week in America alone, and spawned hits like Enter Sandman and Nothing Else Matters that would be played on radio stations and in arenas for decades to come. From the outside looking in, James Hetfield had achieved everything a musician could dream of. Yet success has a peculiar way of exposing the cracks that poverty and struggle had previously concealed. And for James, those cracks ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. The relentless touring schedule that followed the album's release pushed the band to their physical and psychological limits, with Metallica performing over 200 shows across 3 continents in the span of 18 months. James found himself trapped in an endless cycle of hotel rooms, backstage areas, and tour buses, surrounded by thousands of adoring fans every night, yet feeling more isolated than he had ever felt in his entire life. The vodka started as a way to calm his nerves before shows, then became a way to come down after the adrenaline of performing, and eventually evolved into the only thing that could quiet the relentless voice in his head that kept telling him he was a fraud, that he did not deserve any of this, and that sooner or later the world would figure out that James Hetfield was nothing more than a scared kid from a broken home pretending to be a rock star. What made James Hetfield's descent particularly devastating was the fact that he had spent his entire adult life running from a childhood marked by trauma, loss, and a religious upbringing that left deep psychological scars he had never properly addressed. His mother, Cynthia, who had died of cancer when James was 16 years old, and her death was made infinitely more painful by the fact that she belonged to a Christian Science church that rejected medical treatment, meaning James watched helplessly as his mother refused the chemotherapy that might have saved her life because she believed that prayer alone would cure her disease. That experience shattered something fundamental inside the young James Hetfield, leaving him with a complicated relationship to faith, authority, and the very concept of asking for help. Because the one time his mother had needed help the most, the people she trusted had convinced her that accepting it would be a betrayal of her beliefs. By 1992, James had never dealt with this grief in any meaningful way, choosing instead to channel it into the aggressive, a pounding music that made Metallica famous, and to numb whatever feelings surfaced with increasing amounts of alcohol. The problem was that success had stripped away all the distractions that previously kept those feelings at bay. And now, with nothing left to prove and nowhere left to climb, James Hetfield was forced to confront the emptiness that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. He was 30 years old, wealthy beyond his wildest dreams, married to a beautiful woman, worshipped by millions of fans around the world, and completely convinced that none of it mattered and that he would be better off if he simply disappeared. The night that would change everything began like countless other nights during that dark period, with James sitting alone in his suite at the Sunset Marquis Hotel in West Hollywood, just working his way through a bottle of Smirnoff while the television played unwatched in the corner, and the minibar sat empty because he had already consumed everything in it hours earlier. The rest of Metallica was scattered across Los Angeles, enjoying a rare break from touring before the band was scheduled to resume the Wherever We May Roam tour. But James had isolated himself from his bandmates because being around other people required a kind of energy he no longer possessed. He had stopped answering phone calls from his wife, stopped returning messages from management, and spent most of his waking hours either drinking or thinking about drinking, his mind circling the same dark thoughts, like a vulture waiting for something to die. What James did not know was that his spiral had not gone unnoticed by someone who understood exactly what he was going through. Someone who had watched from a distance as the young Metallica frontman transformed from a hungry, ambitious musician into a hollow shell going through the motions of a career that no longer seemed to bring him any joy. Lemmy Kilmister had been observing James for months, seeing himself in the younger man's 1,000-yard stare and recognizing the particular kind of destruction that came from trying to drink away pain that alcohol could never touch. Lemmy knew that look because he had worn it himself during his darkest days, and he also knew that sometimes the only person who could reach someone falling into that abyss was someone who had already fallen there themselves and somehow found their way back out. The phone in James Hetfield's hotel room rang at 17 minutes past 3 in the morning, and James almost did not answer it because he assumed it was either his wife trying to reach him again or some label executive with another demand on his time. He let it ring 6 times before finally picking up, his voice thick with alcohol and exhaustion, and the sound he heard on the other end cut through his drunken fog like a knife through butter. The unmistakable rasp of Lemmy Kilmister, that voice that sounded like gravel soaked in whiskey and run over by a truck, came through the receiver with a directness that left no room for small talk or evasion. Lemmy did not waste time with pleasantries or expressions of concern because he understood that men like James Hetfield had been trained to deflect sympathy and reject any suggestion that they might need help. Instead, Lemmy simply told James that he was sitting at the Rainbow Bar and Grill, that he had a bottle of Jack Daniels with James's name on it, and that James was going to get in a cab and come down there right now because Lemmy was not asking. There was something in the command, in the absolute certainty of Lemmy's voice, that cut through the alcohol and the self-pity and the paralysis that had kept James trapped in that hotel room for days. 20 minutes later, James Hetfield walked through the doors of the Rainbow, and what happened over the next several hours would remain their secret for more than 2 decades. On the Rainbow Bar and Grill on Sunset Boulevard had been Lemmy's second home for decades, a place where rock and roll royalty mixed with aspiring musicians, where legends were made and destroyed with equal regularity, and where the bassist from Motorhead held court at his regular booth like a king surveying his domain. When James Hetfield walked in that night, Lemmy was sitting alone in his usual spot, a glass of Jack Daniels and Coke in front of him, and a cigarette burning between his fingers, his eyes tracking James across the room with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world. James slid into the booth across from Lemmy, and for a long moment, neither man said anything. The silence between them heavy with everything that did not need to be spoken aloud. Lemmy poured James a drink from the bottle on the table, slid it across, and then began to talk in that low, steady voice about things he had never told anyone, about the demons that had chased him through his own career, about the friends he had buried, and the moments when he too had wondered whether any of it was worth the pain. He talked about his years as a roadie for Jimi Hendrix, about watching one of the greatest musicians who ever lived destroy himself with drugs and loneliness, about the specific tragedy of being surrounded by people who wanted something from you while having no one who actually knew you. He talked about getting kicked out of Hawkwind, about the humiliation of being fired from a band he had helped build, about the rage that had fueled him to create Motorhead and prove everyone wrong. And what Lemmy said to James that night was not some profound philosophical revelation or a magical solution to all his problems, but rather a simple recognition of a truth that James had been running from his entire adult life. Lemmy told James that the pain he was feeling was not a sign that something was wrong with him, but proof that he was still human, still capable of feeling, still alive in a world that tried to turn rock stars into machines designed to produce and perform and generate revenue. He told James that the alcohol was not helping him escape the pain, but rather preventing him from ever moving through it, trapping him in an endless loop where the only relief came from substances that ultimately made everything worse. But the thing that truly reached James, the words that would echo in his mind for years to come, were when Lemmy leaned across the table and spoke with an intensity that James had never heard from him before. Lemmy told James that he had watched too many good men destroy themselves because they believed the lie that asking for help was a sign of weakness, that he himself had almost become one of those statistics during his own dark periods, and that the bravest thing any man could do was admit when he was drowning and reach for the hand being offered to him. Coming from anyone else, James might have dismissed these words as empty platitudes, but coming from Lemmy Kilmister, a man who had built his entire image on being the toughest and most uncompromising figure in rock and roll, they carried a weight that penetrated all of James's defenses. They talked until the sun came up over Sunset Boulevard, the bottle of Jack Daniels slowly emptying as the hours passed, and the conversation moved from darkness into something approaching light. Lemmy did not try to fix James, or offer him a 12-step program, or tell him what he should do, but rather simply sat with him in his pain and let him know that he was not alone, that someone understood, and that survival was possible, even when it felt like the only option was surrender. By the time James finally left the Rainbow that morning, something fundamental had shifted inside him. Not a complete transformation, but the first crack in the wall he had built around himself. The first glimmer of possibility that there might be a way forward that did not involve drinking himself into an early grave. James did not get sober that night. He and his struggle with alcohol would continue for nearly another decade before he finally checked himself into rehab in 2001. But what Lemmy gave him that night was something even more important than immediate sobriety, which was the knowledge that he was not alone in his suffering, that even the toughest men in rock and roll had moments of weakness and despair, and that there was no shame in admitting that you needed help. Every time James felt himself sliding back toward the darkness in the years that followed, he would remember Lemmy's voice cutting through the fog, remember that someone had cared enough to reach out when no one else noticed he was drowning, and that memory gave him the strength to keep fighting, even when fighting felt impossible. In the years following that night at the Rainbow, James Hetfield and Lemmy Kilmister never spoke publicly about what had happened, maintaining an unspoken agreement that some things were too sacred and too personal to share with the world. When they saw each other at festivals or industry events, there was a nod of recognition, a brief moment of eye contact that communicated everything that words could not. But neither man ever referenced the conversation that had saved James's life. Lemmy continued to project his image of invincibility, the immortal Motorhead frontman who would outlive them all, while James continued to battle his demons in private, eventually reaching the point where he could no longer deny that he needed professional help. What the public saw during those years was two titans of heavy metal occasionally crossing paths, sharing stages at festivals like Monsters of Rock and Download, and expressing mutual admiration in interviews without ever revealing the depth of their connection. James would speak about Lemmy as an influence and a legend, would praise Motorhead as one of the most important bands in heavy metal history. But he never mentioned the night that Lemmy had reached out to him in his darkest hour, or the words that had given him a reason to keep going. The secret remained locked between them, a bond forged in vulnerability that neither man felt comfortable exposing to the harsh light of public scrutiny. James Hetfield's struggle with alcohol continued throughout the 1990s, even as Metallica released Load and Reload and remained one of the biggest bands in the world. The drinking that had nearly destroyed him in 1992 became a managed addiction, something he could control well enough to continue functioning, but never something he could truly escape. He would have periods of relative sobriety followed by relapses, moments of clarity followed by blackouts, and through it all, he carried the memory of that night with Lemmy as both an inspiration and a reminder of what was at stake. Every time he picked up a bottle, he heard Lemmy's voice asking him whether this was really the path he wanted to walk. And sometimes that voice was enough to make him put the bottle back down. The breaking point finally came in 2001. When the toll of years of drinking became impossible to ignore, and James realized that he was on the verge of losing everything that mattered to him, including his marriage, his band, and his life. He checked into a rehabilitation facility and began the long, painful process of confronting the demons he had been running from since childhood, finally doing the work that Lemmy had told him was necessary all those years ago at the Rainbow. When James emerged from rehab, he was a changed man, still the powerful frontman of Metallica, but now operating with a clarity and presence that had been missing for years, and he credited his recovery to a combination of professional help, family support, and the seed that had been planted on that night in 1992. On December 28, 2015, the news that heavy metal fans around the world had dreaded for decades finally arrived when Lemmy Kilmister passed away at the age of 70, just 4 days after receiving a diagnosis of an aggressive form of cancer. The man who had seemed immortal, who had survived 50 years of hard living that would have killed most people 10 times over, was finally gone, and the rock and roll world went into mourning for a legend who had defined what it meant to be uncompromising and authentic in an industry that often rewarded neither quality. Messages of condolence poured in from every corner of the music world, from Ozzy Osbourne to Dave Grohl to Slash, each one paying tribute to a man who had influenced generations of musicians and fans. James Hetfield received the news while at home in Colorado, and the weight of it hit him harder than he had expected. Not just the loss of a fellow musician, but the loss of the man who had saved his life 23 years earlier without ever asking for anything in return. For more than 2 decades, James had kept their secret, honoring the unspoken agreement that what happened at the Rainbow stayed at the Rainbow. But now that Lemmy was gone, James found himself overwhelmed by the need to finally speak the truth about what his friend had meant to him. The burden of silence that had once felt like a sacred trust now felt like an injustice. Like Lemmy deserved to be remembered not just as a rock and roll icon, but as a man capable of extraordinary compassion and wisdom. In the days following Lemmy's death, James Hetfield gave a series of interviews in which he spoke about his relationship with the Motorhead frontman, with a candor that surprised even those who had known him for years. He talked about Lemmy's influence on Metallica, about the nights they had spent together at the Rainbow, and then, for the first time, he revealed the truth about what had happened in 1992. James spoke about being lost in darkness, about feeling like success had become a prison rather than a liberation, and about the phone call that came in the middle of the night from a man who understood exactly what he was going through. The reaction to James's revelation was immediate and powerful, with fans and fellow musicians alike expressing their astonishment that such a significant moment in heavy metal history had remained hidden for so long. But what struck people most was not the drama of the story, but the vulnerability of James's telling. The way his voice cracked when he described Lemmy's words, the tears that came to his eyes when he talked about finally understanding what his friend had given him that night. For a man who had spent his career projecting an image of strength and aggression, the willingness to show such raw emotion was a testament to how deeply Lemmy's loss had affected him, and how important it was for the world to know the full truth about the man behind the legend. When James Hetfield took the stage at Lemmy's memorial service, held at the Rainbow Bar and Grill where so much of their history had unfolded, he performed a version of Ace of Spades that was both a tribute and a farewell. His voice filled with an emotion that went far beyond professional respect. Looking out at the crowd of musicians and fans who had gathered to say goodbye, James saw faces he recognized from decades of tours and festivals, people who had known Lemmy in their own ways, but who had no idea about the private connection between the two men. In that moment, James realized that Lemmy's greatest legacy might not be the music he created or the image he projected, but the countless lives he touched through acts of kindness and compassion that he never sought credit for. The story of that night in 1992 has become part of heavy metal mythology, and a reminder that even the toughest exteriors often hide the deepest wells of humanity, and that rock and roll brotherhood means being there for each other, not just during the good times, but especially during the darkness. James Hetfield continues to speak openly about his struggles with addiction and his journey to recovery, often citing Lemmy as one of the people who helped him survive long enough to find his way to the light. Every time James takes the stage with Metallica, playing the songs that have soundtracked generations of lives, he carries with him the memory of a phone call at 3 in the morning and the gravelly voice that refused to let him give up. Lemmy Kilmister never sought recognition for saving James Hetfield's life, never mentioned it in interviews or used it to burnish his own legend, because that was simply not who he was. He saw a fellow musician drowning, reached out his hand, and never expected anything in return except that James would keep fighting and keep making music that mattered. In a world that often reduces rock stars to caricatures of excess and self-destruction, Lemmy's act of compassion stands as a reminder that beneath the leather and the whiskey and the crushing volume of Motorhead was a man who understood that sometimes The most rock and roll thing you can do is save someone's life and never tell a soul about it.